The last Lombards of Italy. Italy did not become peaceful after the fall of the Lombard Kingdom. It became fragmented. In 774, Charlemagne crossed the Alps, besieged Pavia, and ended more than 2 centuries of Lombard rule in northern Italy. The crown of the Lombards passed into Frankish hands, and the political map of the peninsula shifted once again. But the Lombards did not disappear. Far to the south, beyond the reach of Frankish administration, one Lombard state survived: Benevento. Protected by distance and geography, the Duchy of Benevento remained independent long after the Lombard Kingdom had fallen. From its hilltop capital in the southern Apennines, Lombard princes ruled a rugged inland territory surrounded by rivals. To the north stood the expanding power of the Carolingian Empire. Along the coasts, the Byzantine Empire still held ancient Roman cities and strategic ports. Across the sea in Sicily, Muslim emirates launched raids deep into the Italian mainland. And between these powers, the Italian peninsula fractured into a maze of duchies, cities, and rival princes. For centuries, Benevento endured in this unstable world. It survived invasions, civil wars, imperial interventions, and shifting alliances that reshaped the balance of power across southern Italy. At times it stood alone. At other times it became the center of a Lombard revival that briefly unified much of the south. But the forces gathering around it were far larger than any Lombard state could control. Empires from the north, armies from the east, raiders from the Mediterranean, and eventually a new people arriving from the far side of Europe. Warriors who would reshape Italy once again. This is the story of the Duchy and Principality of Benevento, the last Lombard power in Italy, and the long struggle for control of the southern peninsula in the centuries after Charlemagne. When Charlemagne destroyed the Lombard Kingdom in 774, the political center of Lombard power disappeared overnight. Pavia fell. King Desiderius was captured. Northern Italy passed into the control of the Frankish Empire. But Lombard rule did not end everywhere. Far to the south, the Duchy of Benevento remained beyond Frankish reach. The duchy had been founded more than 2 centuries earlier during the Lombard invasion of Italy, when migrating Lombard warbands pushed deep into the southern peninsula and established independent territories far from the northern royal court. Geography protected it. The mountains of central Italy, the fragmented authority of the papacy, and the surviving Byzantine territories along the coasts created a natural barrier between Benevento and the new Carolingian rulers of the north. Charlemagne understood this reality. Rather than attempt a costly campaign into the southern Apennines, he accepted a compromise. The Lombard rulers of Benevento acknowledged Frankish authority in name, but in practice, they continued to govern their lands as independent princes. Over time, that independence became permanent. During the late 8th and 9th centuries, Benevento evolved from a Lombard duchy into one of the most powerful states in southern Italy. Its rulers adopted the title Prince of Benevento, signaling that their authority no longer depended on the memory of the Lombard Kingdom in the north. Yet Benevento did not rule the south alone. The Italian peninsula had become a mosaic of competing powers. Byzantine governors controlled important coastal territories in Apulia and Calabria, maintaining the Eastern Empire's presence in Italy centuries after the fall of Rome. Independent maritime cities such as Naples, Gaeta, and Amalfi built their own fleets and defended their autonomy through trade and diplomacy. And across the narrow Strait of Messina, the Muslim rulers of Sicily launched raids that reached far into the mainland. In this fractured landscape, Benevento stood at the center of Lombard power in the south. But its greatest threat would not come from foreign empires. It would come from within, because Lombard rule in southern Italy was never truly unified. And in the 9th century, the state that had survived the fall of the Lombard Kingdom began to fracture into rival principalities. The result would permanently reshape the political map of southern Italy. By the 9th century, the Principality of Benevento had become the largest Lombard state in southern Italy. Its princes ruled vast inland territories stretching across the southern Apennines, commanding mountain passes, fertile valleys, and the roads that connected the Adriatic and Tyrrhenian coasts. But Benevento carried the same weakness that had plagued the Lombard Kingdom before it. Power was personal. Authority rested in the hands of princes, dukes, and military elites whose loyalty depended on family alliances and regional interests. When leadership was strong, the state held together. When it weakened, rival factions quickly emerged. That weakness exploded into open conflict in the year 839. After the death of Prince Sicard of Benevento, a struggle for succession broke out between two rivals. One faction supported Radulchais, who seized Benevento itself. Another backed Sicanulf, who fled south and established a rival court. The conflict quickly escalated into a brutal civil war that tore Lombard Italy apart. Both sides sought allies wherever they could find them. Byzantine officials intervened. Local dukes shifted loyalties. Even Muslim forces from Sicily were hired as mercenaries, bringing devastation to cities and monasteries across the southern peninsula. The war dragged on for nearly a decade. By the time it ended in 849, the old Lombard state had been permanently divided. The Principality of Benevento survived, but it was no longer alone. To the west, a new Lombard state had emerged, the Principality of Salerno. Its rulers controlled the fertile coastal plains and the trade routes of the Tyrrhenian Sea. The once dominant Lombard south was now split between rival principalities, and Benevento's power was weakened even further by the rise of ambitious neighboring rulers. Among them were the princes of Capua, a Lombard city-state that would soon grow into one of the most aggressive powers in the region. Southern Italy had become a political puzzle of small states, shifting alliances, and constant warfare. In the decades that followed, Benevento would struggle to maintain its independence. But in the 10th century, a new ruler would emerge who briefly restored Lombard power across much of the south. His name was Pandulf, and history would remember him as Pandulf Ironhead. The division of the Lombard south after 839 did not bring stability to Italy. Instead, it created a landscape of rival principalities competing for dominance across the peninsula. Benevento remained the largest Lombard state inland. Salerno controlled the western coast, and to the north, a third power was rising quietly along the Volturno River, Capua. Originally a Lombard duchy within the Beneventan realm, Capua had grown into an independent principality during the chaos of the 9th century. Its rulers were ambitious, militarized, and strategically positioned along the road networks that linked southern Italy with Rome and the central peninsula. By the early 10th century, Capua had become the most aggressive Lombard state in the region. In 900, Prince Aetnulf I of Capua made his move. Instead of competing with Benevento, he conquered it. For the first time in generations, the two largest Lombard states of southern Italy were united under a single ruler. The new realm became known as Capua Benevento, a Lombard power stretching across the mountainous interior of the peninsula. But Aetnulf understood the problem that had destroyed Lombard unity in the past: succession. Lombard states had a long history of fragmentation whenever rulers died and heirs divided the realm. To prevent this, Aetnulf introduced a new political system designed to keep the state intact. It was called indivisum, the principle that the realm should never be divided. Instead of splitting territory between heirs, princes would rule jointly as co-rulers, sharing authority over the entire state. This system was unusual by medieval standards, but for a time it worked. Capua and Benevento remained united through multiple generations of Lombard princes. The combined principality became one of the most powerful inland states in southern Italy, capable of challenging Byzantine influence and negotiating with the rising German emperors in the north. Yet the true expansion of Lombard power would not come under Aetnulf. It would come under a ruler born a generation later, a prince who would unite nearly all Lombard lands in southern Italy under his authority, a ruler remembered in the chronicles by a name that reflected both fear and respect: Pandulf Ironhead. By the middle of the 10th century, southern Italy remained a fractured landscape. The Lombard principalities of Capua, Benevento, and Salerno competed for power inland. Byzantine governors still controlled the coastal regions of Apulia and Calabria, maintaining the Eastern Empire's last foothold in Italy. Independent maritime cities such as Naples, Gaeta, and Amalfi guarded their autonomy through trade and diplomacy. No single ruler controlled the south. That changed with the rise of Pandulf I, later known as Pandulf Ironhead. Born around 925, Pandulf inherited the Principality of Capua and Benevento during a period of constant warfare and shifting alliances. From the beginning of his rule, he proved to be far more ambitious than the princes who came before him. Rather than simply defending Lombard territory, Pandulf sought to dominate the political landscape of southern Italy. His rise was made possible through a powerful alliance. Pandulf aligned himself with Otto I, the German king who would soon become Holy Roman Emperor. This alliance gave the Lombard prince something earlier rulers had lacked: the backing of imperial authority from the north. With imperial support, Pandulf expanded his influence rapidly. Over time, he gained control not only of Capua and Benevento, but also the Lombard Principality of Salerno and the central Italian Duchy of Spoleto. For a brief moment in the 10th century, nearly all Lombard territories in southern Italy were united under a single ruler. It was the closest the Lombards had come to rebuilding their lost kingdom since the fall of Pavia 2 centuries earlier. But Pandulf's power did not rest solely on conquest. He was also a master of diplomacy and imperial politics. The princes of southern Italy navigated a delicate balance between larger empires. To the north stood the Holy Roman Empire. To the east remained the Byzantine Empire, still determined to maintain its authority along the Adriatic coast. Pandulf understood that survival required choosing sides. He chose the emperors of the north. By supporting the Attinian emperors in their campaigns in Italy, Pandulf secured imperial recognition and strengthened his authority over rival Lombard rulers. In return, the emperors relied on him as their strongest ally in the southern peninsula. For a generation, this alliance created a new balance of power in Italy. Under Pandulf Ironhead, Lombard authority reached its greatest extent since the days before Charlemagne. But that dominance would not last, because in the year 982, an imperial campaign in southern Italy would end in disaster, a catastrophe that would shatter Lombard unity and reopen the struggle for control of the peninsula. By the late 10th century, the balance of power in southern Italy had drawn the attention of the Holy Roman Empire itself. The Attinian emperors had long claimed authority over the Italian peninsula, but their control weakened the farther south one traveled. Byzantine governors still ruled the coastal provinces of Apulia and Calabria, while Lombard princes held the mountainous interior. To the emperors in the north, this fragmented south represented both an opportunity and a problem. In 982, Emperor Otto II, son of Otto the Great, launched an ambitious campaign into southern Italy. His goal was nothing less than the complete domination of the region. If successful, the empire would push Byzantine authority out of the peninsula and extend imperial power all the way to the Mediterranean. But Otto's campaign carried another objective. Across the narrow waters of the Strait of Messina, Muslim rulers in Sicily had built a powerful emirate that regularly raided the Italian mainland. Otto intended not only to secure southern Italy, but eventually to invade Sicily itself. The emperor gathered a massive army of German, Lombard, and imperial forces and marched south. At first, the campaign seemed successful. Imperial troops advanced deep into Calabria, pushing toward the coast. But near the town of Stilo, along the Ionian Sea, Otto's army encountered the forces of the Muslim emir of Sicily. The battle that followed would become one of the most devastating defeats in the history of the early Holy Roman Empire. At the beginning of the engagement, Otto's heavily armored cavalry launched a powerful assault that appeared to break the enemy line. Believing victory was within reach, the imperial army pursued the retreating forces across the battlefield. But the retreat had been a trap. Muslim cavalry units regrouped and counterattacked, surrounding large portions of the imperial army. In the chaos that followed, imperial formations collapsed. Commanders were killed, nobles were cut down, and the battlefield descended into a rout. The defeat at Stilo was catastrophic. Many of the leading princes of Lombard Italy were killed in a single day. Among the dead were several rulers connected to the Lombard dynasties that had dominated the region for generations. Otto II himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing the battlefield by ship. The disaster shattered the fragile political order that had existed under Pandulf Ironhead. Without strong leadership, the united Lombard territories began to fragment once again. Rival princes returned to their own ambitions, and the balance of power across southern Italy shifted rapidly. The defeat had consequences far beyond the battlefield, because the collapse of Lombard unity would open the door for a new power, one that had not yet appeared on the Italian stage. A people who would arrive not as princes or emperors, but as mercenaries, warriors from the far north of Europe, the Normans. The disaster at Stilo did more than destroy an army. It shattered the fragile political order that had held southern Italy together. For nearly a generation, Pandulf Ironhead had maintained Lombard dominance across the interior of the peninsula. His authority, backed by the power of the Attinian emperors, had kept rival princes in check and balanced the influence of Byzantium along the coast. But after the catastrophe of 982, that system collapsed. Pandulf died the following year. Without his leadership, the realm he had assembled unraveled almost immediately. The territories that had once formed a single Lombard power split once again into competing principalities. Capua, Benevento, and Salerno returned to separate rule, each governed by its own dynasty, each pursuing its own ambitions. Unity had lasted only a generation. Across southern Italy, the political map fractured into a maze of rival states. The Lombard princes controlled much of the mountainous interior, ruling from fortified cities that had once formed the backbone of their old kingdom. Along the coasts, the Byzantine Empire still held its last Italian provinces. Governors based in Apulia and Calabria commanded imperial garrisons and maintained Constantinople's influence over the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Between these larger powers stood a number of fiercely independent maritime cities. Naples, Gaeta, and Amalfi had grown wealthy through Mediterranean trade. Their rulers defended their autonomy through diplomacy, alliances, and the occasional use of hired armies. And to the south, across the narrow Strait of Messina, the Muslim Emirate of Sicily remained a constant threat. Raiding fleets sailed regularly from the island, striking monasteries, towns, and coastal settlements across the mainland. For centuries, southern Italy had lived under the shadow of these attacks. By the end of the 10th century, the peninsula had become one of the most politically fragmented regions in Europe. No single power dominated the south. Instead, Italy was divided between Lombard princes, Byzantine governors, maritime republics, imperial ambitions from the north, and Muslim rulers in Sicily. Every border was unstable. Every ruler watched his neighbors carefully. Every city searched for allies. This fractured world would soon attract a new kind of warrior, not princes, not emperors, but soldiers. Men who arrived in Italy with no kingdoms of their own, only swords, ambition, and a reputation for relentless warfare. They came from the far north of Europe, and history would remember them as the Normans. Section 8. The arrival of the Normans. At the turn of the 11th century, the balance of power in southern Italy was fragile. Lombard princes ruled the interior. Byzantine governors controlled the eastern coast. Independent cities guarded their harbors. And Muslim fleets from Sicily continued to raid the mainland. In this unstable world, rulers were always searching for soldiers. Armies were small. Loyalties shifted quickly, and warfare between rival states was constant. To strengthen their forces, many princes turned to mercenaries, professional warriors willing to fight for whoever could afford them. It was through this system that a new people entered the politics of southern Italy, the Normans. They came originally from Normandy in northern France, a land whose own history was shaped by conquest. The Normans were descendants of Viking settlers who had carved out a powerful duchy along the coast of the English Channel. By the 11th century, their reputation as fierce and disciplined warriors was well known across Europe. Some arrived in Italy as pilgrims traveling to the great shrine of Monte Gargano in Apulia. Others came as wandering knights in search of opportunity. But once they reached southern Italy, they quickly discovered something important. The peninsula was filled with wars, and every ruler needed soldiers. Norman warriors soon began offering their services as mercenaries. Lombard princes hired them to fight rival Lombards. Byzantine governors recruited them for campaigns against rebellious cities. Even local rulers used them to defend their territories against raids from Sicily. At first, these Norman groups were small bands of mounted warriors led by ambitious captains. But they possessed two advantages that made them extremely valuable: discipline and cavalry. Norman knights fought as heavily armed horsemen, trained for aggressive shock combat that could break enemy lines in battle. In a region where many armies were made up of local militias and infantry levies, these mounted warriors quickly gained a reputation for battlefield effectiveness. Success brought rewards. Princes who could not always pay their mercenaries in gold often compensated them with something else: land. What began as temporary military service slowly transformed into something much more dangerous. Norman captains started to establish permanent bases in the Italian countryside. Fortified settlements appeared across Apulia and Campania. Small territories granted to mercenaries gradually turned into independent lordships. The Normans had arrived in Italy as soldiers for hire. But within a few decades, they would become something entirely different: rulers, and their rise would change the political map of southern Italy forever. What began as mercenary service soon evolved into conquest. By the early 11th century, Norman warriors had established small footholds across southern Italy. At first they served Lombard princes or Byzantine governors, fighting local wars in exchange for payment and land. But the Normans quickly discovered that the fractured politics of the peninsula offered something far greater than employment. It offered opportunity. Among the first Norman leaders to seize that opportunity was the Drengot family. In the 1030s, a group of Norman knights under Rainulf Drengot entered the service of Lombard rulers in Campania. As a reward for their military support, Rainulf was granted the territory of Aversa. It was a small county, but it was the first permanent Norman state in Italy. From this foothold, Norman influence spread rapidly. Another Norman family soon arrived whose ambitions would reshape the entire south: the Hautevilles. They came from a minor noble family in Normandy, but the sons of Tancred de Hauteville possessed something far more valuable than titles. They had military talent and relentless ambition. Throughout the mid-11th century, the Hauteville brothers fought across southern Italy, serving different masters before gradually carving out territories of their own. Battles against Lombard princes, Byzantine armies, and rival mercenary groups slowly expanded Norman power. The most famous of these brothers was Robert Guiscard. Under his leadership, the Normans began transforming from mercenaries into conquerors. Robert reorganized Norman forces, combining heavily armored cavalry with disciplined infantry and siege tactics learned from years of campaigning across the peninsula. Instead of fighting as hired soldiers, the Normans now fought to build a state. Their greatest obstacle was the Byzantine Empire, which still controlled large portions of southern Italy. One by one, Norman armies attacked Byzantine strongholds in Apulia. Cities that had remained under imperial rule for centuries began to fall. The decisive moment came in 1071, when Norman forces captured the great fortress city of Bari. Bari had been the capital of Byzantine authority in Italy. Its fall ended more than 500 years of continuous Eastern Roman presence on the peninsula. But the Norman conquest did not stop there. To the south, Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger launched campaigns across the strait into Sicily, where Muslim emirs had ruled for over 2 centuries. The struggle for the island would take decades, but Norman armies slowly advanced, capturing cities and fortresses until the last. Muslim strongholds fell. By the end of the 11th century, a new political power dominated southern Italy and Sicily. The Normans. What had begun with small bands of mercenaries had become a new kingdom, one that controlled the southern half of the Italian peninsula and the strategic island at the center of the Mediterranean. For the Lombards, this transformation marked the end of an era. The principalities that had once ruled the south, Benevento, Capua, and Salerno, gradually lost their independence as Norman rulers absorbed their territories into a new political order. The Lombards had once conquered Italy as migrants and warriors. Now, after centuries of survival and adaptation, their final states disappeared beneath the rise of a new power, a kingdom forged not by emperors or ancient dynasties, but by mercenaries who had come to Italy in search of war. By the late 11th century, the political world that had sustained the Lombard principalities for centuries was disappearing. For generations, the princes of Benevento, Capua, and Salerno had survived by balancing larger powers. They negotiated with Byzantine governors, resisted imperial intervention from the north, and defended their territories against raids from Sicily. That delicate balance no longer existed. The rise of the Normans changed everything. Unlike the fragmented rulers of southern Italy, the Norman leaders who emerged during the 11th century were building something far more centralized. Under commanders like Robert Guiscard and Roger Hauteville, Norman armies conquered territory systematically, replacing older political structures with a new network of feudal lordships. Cities that had once belonged to Lombard princes were gradually absorbed into Norman domains. Salerno fell under Norman control in the late 11th century. Capua followed soon after, becoming another Norman possession. Across the south, Lombard dynasties that had ruled for generations were displaced or reduced to minor local nobles. Only Benevento survived as a political entity, but even its survival came with a cost. Rather than falling to Norman conquest, Benevento eventually passed into the authority of the papacy, becoming a papal territory rather than an independent Lombard state. The principality that had once stood as the last Lombard power in Italy was transformed into a small enclave ruled from Rome. By the end of the 11th century, the Lombards no longer controlled the southern peninsula. Their political world had vanished. In its place stood a new power, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, a state that united southern Italy and the island of Sicily under one of the most dynamic dynasties of the medieval Mediterranean. Yet the Lombards did not disappear entirely. Their language faded, but their law codes continued to influence regional governance. Their churches and monasteries remained important cultural centers. Cities they had ruled for centuries continued to carry the marks of Lombard settlement and tradition. For more than 200 years after the fall of their northern kingdom, the Lombards had endured in the south. They survived conquest. They survived civil war. They survived the rise and fall of emperors. But in the end, they could not survive the arrival of a new warrior elite. The Normans had come to Italy as mercenaries. They left as kings. And with their rise, the final chapter of Lombard political power came to an end. Section 11, Final Reflection, The Last Lombards. The Lombards arrived in Italy as migrants. In the 6th century, they crossed the Alps not as administrators or emperors, but as a people in motion, warriors, families and clans searching for land and opportunity in a peninsula weakened by war. They conquered it by force, but they ruled it by adaptation. Over generations, the Lombards transformed from tribal warbands into princes of cities, governors of Roman provinces, and patrons of monasteries and churches. They adopted the language of the land they ruled, preserved its legal traditions, and governed from the same cities that had once served Roman emperors. Italy did not become Lombard. The Lombards became Italian. Even after the fall of their kingdom in the north, their power endured in the south for more than 2 centuries. From Benevento, Lombard princes shaped the politics of the peninsula, balancing between empires, resisting invasions, and navigating the unstable frontier between Byzantium, the papacy, and the Muslim Mediterranean. For a time, rulers like Pandulf Ironhead even came close to restoring Lombard dominance across the south. But history rarely leaves political vacuums unfilled. The fragmented world of southern Italy, divided between Lombard princes, Byzantine governors, and independent cities, created the perfect conditions for a new power to rise. The Normans. Like the Lombards before them, they arrived as outsiders. Like the Lombards, they came first as warriors. But unlike the Lombards, they built something larger, a unified kingdom that would dominate southern Italy and Sicily for centuries. When Norman rulers absorbed the last Lombard states, the political story of the Lombards finally came to an end. Yet their legacy remained. In the cities they ruled, in the monasteries they built, in the laws they preserved, and the culture they helped shape. The Lombards were not simply another barbarian kingdom that rose and fell after Rome. They were the bridge between the ancient Roman world and the medieval Italy that followed. And for more than 200 years after the fall of their northern kingdom, the last Lombards of Benevento proved that even in a fractured peninsula surrounded by empires, a small state could survive. For a time, the Lombards vanished as rulers of Italy. But the world they shaped endured in the kingdoms, cultures, and conflicts that followed.